Mountain View family, thank you for joining us again for the Mountaintop Advent series. As we continue to read through the book, Love Came Down at Christmas by Sinclair B. Ferguson. Chapter 20, Growing Up. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11. It seems that no matter what gift you give to toddlers, they are always much more interested in the Christmas wrapping paper than in the present it contains. This phenomenon is usually met with coos of delight and general amusement among the adults. After all, there is something undeniably attractive in infants acting as infants. But if you see your 7-year-old doing the same thing, you might be a little anxious that he is not developing properly. If you were to see an 18-year-old disregarding the games console and climbing inside the cardboard box instead, you'd be concerned that something is seriously wrong. Paul says that, spiritually speaking, you and I are often like fully grown adults playing in cardboard box. That was certainly true of the Corinthians. Helping people grow to full maturity in Christ lay near the heart of Paul's ministry. He told the Christians in Colossae that he wanted to present everyone mature in Christ, and added, "For this I toil, struggling with all his energy, that he powerfully works within me." Of course, new converts do not mature overnight. Paul had spent a full 18 months with the Corinthians, helping them to grow. But he was not seeing the maturity he desired. Rather, the reverse. He had already told them that he couldn't treat them like adults because they were behaving like spiritual infants. Distressingly, instead of putting away childish ways, they seemed to think that they were marks of spiritual maturity. They were like children who began to smoke cigarettes at the age of 9, thinking that they are being grown up, and when they were only revealing their immaturity and lack of discernment. Several things were stunting the Corinthians' growth, and we'd be wise to consider whether they are stunting our growth too. We have already seen that the Corinthians had an unhealthy interest in ranking preachers, not realizing that they were depriving themselves of the privilege of the ministry of them all. Imagine being in a church where you had the opportunity to hear Simon Peter, Paul the Apostle, and Apollos preach. Arguing about which one was best meant that they were denying themselves the blessings God wanted to give them through all three of them. And then they were lacking in discernment. They were enumerating of certain more spectacular spiritual gifts and had lost sight of the importance of love. Earlier in his letter, Paul points out other signs of their immaturity. They had not taken seriously enough the fact that there was blatant sin in the church fellowship. They were disgracing the name of Christ by some of their behavior patterns. But two other symptoms of their stunted growth were particularly significant. The first was that, when it came to life choices, their view was that they could do whatever they wanted, so long as it was lawful, or there was nothing wrong with it. Perhaps you recognize that tendency. But for Paul, that is the response of an immature Christian. If a Christian at all, it misses the point, it fails to ask the most important question: is this for the glory of the Lord? Earlier, it had suggested ways in which they could tell whether that was true or not. Will this really help advance our Christian life? Will this have a tendency to enslave me? Will this help me to become a mature believer? Will this be a real help to my fellow Christians? These are the kinds of questions that we ought to ask as we decide where to spend our time, how to use our money, and what our plans are for the year ahead. The second symptom of the Corinthians' stunted growth was the perspective they had on worship. Their focus was on their personal gifts. That was a form of narcissism, not a recipe for ministry. They were far too concerned with the spectacular and the unusual in worship, and with what their gifts said about them. Paul was far more concerned about what is central in worship, namely the presence of God among his people, so that if an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convinced or convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so, falling on his face, he would worship God and declare that God is really among you. So, Paul could not speak to the Corinthians as grown-up Christians. Like the author of Hebrews, he could have written to them, "You need milk, not solid food. For solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil." They simply lacked a focus on the glory of God and the presence of wisdom in their thinking, in their assessments, and in their choices. Alas, the Corinthians had forgotten something about Jesus. As he grew physically, he also grew spiritually. And by the time he was 12, he had increased in wisdom and in favor with God. He kept on growing in discernment and in his Father's favor. Perhaps like many Christians, they had given little thought to this. If so, they were thinking of Jesus as an idea rather than as a real person who was fully and truly man. They had not reflected on the fact that the commitment of the Son of God to the incarnation was also a commitment to grow and develop, not only physically, beginning as an embryo in the womb and growing into full manhood, but also in experience and in obedience of what he suffered, and in favor with God. Jesus' obedience to his Father grew through every test he faced until the final examination, when he became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. As a child, he had loved his parents. As a 12-year-old boy, he had lovingly obeyed the fifth commandment. Although his parents had misunderstood him, he filled to the full the loving obedience of a pre-teenager. His wilderness temptations were yet a greater test that called for greater expressions of that love for his Father. And his crucifixion called for the final fulfillment of that loving obedience, which he had shown more and more as it was tested throughout the whole course of his life. If the Master kept on growing, what does that say about his servants? Do you settle for speaking like a child, thinking like a child, and reasoning like a child? It's time to give up being childish and live for the glory of the Lord. All because Christ came down at Christmas. I want to take a moment to thank you for reading along with us today from the book Love Came Down at Christmas. We would like to thank the Good Book Company for graciously allowing us to share this book in its entirety with our followers from camp. To purchase a copy of this book for yourself or for a loved one, please go to thegoodbook.com or Amazon. The links can be found in the description of these readings that we are sharing with you. If you enjoy this book and want to learn more about the author or further publishings, please like or follow the Good Book Company on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We trust you have a safe, joyful, and wonderful holiday season.